Hello and welcome to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast with me, your host, Shiv Sengupta. I'm the author of the Vitaholics Anonymous books, Sobering Insights for Spiritual Addicts, and a manifesto for spiritual anarchy, published by New Sarum Press. They're available through Amazon in Kindle and paperback formats, and you can find them by clicking the links in the description below. Both my books have had a big impact and found great support among many veteran seekers for their willingness to critique spiritual culture, which in my view can act as a decoy designed to keep our vision perpetually focused away from what is most evident. My purpose with the Spiritually Incorrect podcast series is to connect and engage with other writers, thinkers, and teachers who don't necessarily fall into nor subscribe to the traditional guru stereotype. The idea is to explore some of the topics I cover in my books beyond the realm of my own opinions on the matter. So with that being said, I'd like to welcome my next guest. He's a university lecturer based in Tokyo, Japan, and runs the Tokyo Living 123 blog. Welcome, Alan Lindskoog.
Thank you, Shiv. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation. Let's see where it goes.
Absolutely, and it's really early in the morning for you in Tokyo, isn't it? What time is it over there?
Yeah, it's just turned 6:35 in the morning. But I was up bright and early, getting ready. This is good. You're warming me up for my classes, which begin next week. So
okay,
yeah.
I have to tell you up front, I'm envious of you because you still live in Japan and I don't, and that's something we have in common. Right? Not complaining about my current living circumstances. I live in a beautiful place in, Western Canada and British Columbia, but there's just something about Japan, living in Japan, that I miss. And so talk to me a little bit about your experience living in Japan. What made you move there? You're American, correct, originally?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, first, let me say your response about you miss living in Japan is very common. I have a lot of, now a few university former colleagues at the university who've moved back to the States or their home, Canada and stuff as well. And that's a kind of a common reply, is that they really do miss aspects of living in Japan. I'm sorry, what was the question you wanted that you asked me?
Yeah, so just in terms of your story of how you ended up in Japan, because that's not a common sort of trajectory a lot of people take, right? So
yeah, that's right. Yeah, it seems to be a kind of, if I was to look through, if there was a thread in my life, that seems to be kind of a commonality, is not taking that typical path. I discovered Japan really from my time. I was living in New York City for about 8 years. This was, maybe 25 plus years ago, and I was in a relationship with a Japanese woman, and we visited Japan. And it was the first time I'd ever been, in a culture so different than the United States and American culture. And but at the same time, when I was there, there was just something about this place that, I don't know, it was really, I don't know how to describe it other than just to say, I was, enamored with all this, the differences, everything, the language, the food, the terrain, everything, buildings. And it, to be honest, it scared the hell out of me, and that was the same feeling when I first visited New York City, and I ended up living there, but not really knowing what was going to bring me there. And it was the same thing in a way with Japan. Like it was just something about this, but I didn't quite know what was going to bring me here, or to say, I did have a lifelong dream of wanting to live in a culture where, I could speak the language and learn about the culture. My first plan originally was in university where I was going to live in France, but that didn't work out. And then fast forward many years later, Japan. What brought me to Japan eventually was I met my wife, my now wife, on a well, I can say it now. I think back in the day, I'm a little hesitant, but back in the day, you know, a dating site was kind of taboo, you know. So I've been here 15 years. We've been married 14. So, you know, take that back. And if you think like a dating site like Match.com and all that stuff was not commonplace, right? And so, but we met on Match.com and we long distance dated for 2 years.
Yeah, now it'd be like, oh, you didn't meet on a dating site? Like,
yeah.
How else do people meet, right? I think
Exactly.
most kids these days are meeting on their phone somehow or the other. So
yeah, exactly. So we long distance dated for 2 years, and you know, again, antiquated kind of, you know, applications and things. We would talk on the phone on occasion, but you know, and then well, basically what we did is we just, you know, we every other month I would go to Japan. She would come back. She would come to Minneapolis. At the time, I was in at university finishing an undergrad that I had started back in my teenage years, which kind of brings me back to that kind of, you know, not taking the typical path. You know, I failed out. I almost failed out of university back in my 20s. And so in between moving to New York City, after moving from New York City to Minneapolis, I decided to finish my undergrad. And that's when I started studying Japanese language. I met my now wife. We long distance dated for 2 years and decided that I moved to Japan and start our life together. And that's what I did 15 plus years ago.
Now, I've read a couple of articles on your blog, and one that was particularly interesting was your sort of spiritual interest in Japan, most specifically in the Zen tradition, right? And that is actually, you know, a big part of what draws a lot of many foreigners to come and live in Japan, is to explore that spiritual aspect. And one of the big shocks initially is when people move to Japan and realize that the Japanese themselves are not very spiritually oriented at all. In fact, religion is a very practical tool that they use for things like, and this was something I found so interesting, was that the average Japanese person would go to the Buddhist temple for their regular sort of blessings and functions, to a Shinto shrine for New Year's, but then get married in a Christian chapel. And it was almost like, you know, religion just is a practical thing that you use, but it had no deeper meaning, spirituality included. And so I think you'd mentioned in your blog as well that your first exposure to Zen and the Zen monastery was a bit of a shock. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. In fact, we can talk about the book that I'm just finishing up, and will probably be out sometime this summer. And it talks a lot about those kind of things, those kind of shocks. And there's definitely one where when I first moved here, and it's not unlike what you said, when I first moved here, it was like, you know, I was really excited. I was enamored. The temples, I mean, everything about it, you know. And I had studied Soto Zen, Sotoshu, they call it in Japanese, Soto Zen. I was introduced to that like years ago in New York City, and actually Minneapolis in New York City. So I practiced that for a long time. So I had this expectation of, you know, I hit the ground in Tokyo, and, you know, it's like, it's just in the air. You know, I thought, you know, everybody, you know, they go to the temples and there'd be sitting, people would be meditating, all this. It was that almost dramatic when I, you know, and it is a shock. It's like nobody, you know, the Buddhist temples are really, I kind of call it, this is just a very simplistic term, but Buddhist temples, the darkness of life, death, you know, like the funerals I held at Buddhist temples. Shinto is kind of the light, you know, it's like, you know, praise. It's like, you know, you're praying for something good to happen, you know, like you said, New Year's. Yeah. So it was a really big shock, but I was still enamored with it. You know, it's still kind of special, you know. And so even though I realized that people weren't doing that, I was doing it. You know what I mean? And that's, you know, as you know, that's not it. But So I did practice, meditation on my own at home. I kind of made I kind of found my way, with it, even though it wasn't happening. But you're absolutely right when it comes to this kind of grab bag of religion that doesn't have so much of a deep meaning. Although, and I think you lived here for 8 years, so that's a long time where you do get a sense of things. So there is something there that you can't quite put your finger on, and it's not necessarily religion per se, And I don't know if that's something that you've experienced, but
no, it's absolutely something I've experienced. In fact, I would even go as far as to say that's something I have never experienced anywhere else. The very first day that I landed in Hokkaido, which is, by the way, for viewers who are not familiar with Japan, Hokkaido is the northernmost island of Japan, and it's the most remote island, the least populated in terms of per capita landmass. It's very sort of countryside, rural, lots of mountains, lots of agriculture. They called it the breadbasket of Japan because most of the agriculture happens there. So, talk about somebody moving from a big city like Toronto, Canada's largest and most populous city, to a small town in Hokkaido, never been to Japan before, to live there. I hadn't even visited prior to that. But from day one, I had this distinct sense and feeling of this is home. And that feeling has never left me. And I've often reflected on why. And avoiding being too speculative, because I don't want to go into like creating some sort of metaphysical idea here, but there is a certain energy in the land that is palpable. And it's an energy I connected with right away that resonated with me. And not the people, not the culture, the land itself. I attribute this somewhat to the indigenous cultures of Hokkaido, the Ainu people, and the way they live their lives, because it's very, very much like the indigenous cultures of the Americas, right? And we can get into that a little bit later, but there's a lot of language connections between the Native American Indians and the Ainu people of Japan and all of that. And their history is also tragic, very much like the indigenous people of Americas. They were, conquered by the Japanese people, and those islands populated, all of that. But absolutely, I felt this resonant energy that has never left. And now living in Canada, that is what I miss more than the culture and all of that. You get over all of that. But there's something, it's almost like, you're missing a significant other. I wonder if it's something like that for you, or is that how you relate to it?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. As you were talking about the rural aspect, because I live in the equivalent of a suburb of Tokyo, really. I mean, Tokyo is this massive, it's just this massive metropolitan. It's sprawling. From one end to the other, it takes 2+ hours by train. I mean, that's how big, it is. So I live in the suburbs. But it's interesting that when you talked about, you lived in the rural part of Hokkaido. I'm assuming you live in a rural part of Canada, right? So it's not the rural part of it, which I find interesting, which is really interesting because that's not it either, right? And so, I connect with the people. I connect with the culture itself, and I do connect with the land, for better, if you want to call it the land. But I do connect with that. I think I connect with all of it. Although I will say it did not come without some big challenges and overcoming a lot of my Americanism, I guess is probably the best way to put it, And that's what my book's really about, is about that journey of getting to, getting to this place where, I wanted to indoctrinate myself in the culture with the language. One of the things I told myself I would do before I moved here was I would learn the language. I didn't want to be one of those guys because I really wanted to commit to living here, and I didn't want to be one of those foreigners where it's like, I would gravitate to the English-speaking enclaves of central Tokyo where it's easy. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, people do this. It's part of the expat life. This is not a judgment. It's just a personal challenge that I wanted to experience, So 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 I'm living, and so I study the language as best I threw myself into studying the language, trying to understand the culture. Although understanding, and you probably can relate to this, but understanding the culture is one thing. Experiencing it is it's a whole different beast. And it took years to kind of let go of that Americanism, the individual. And again, it's not gone. It's just there's a cultural flexibility that comes with living someplace for a long time. I can jump right into American culture. I can jump into like my Minnesota nice, which is, I can talk about that later, or the kind of New York attitude or whatever. I have that. There's that flexibility after living here for years. So, but I had to really overcome a lot of that kind of narcissist. I'm a kind of a narcissist by nature. It seems that's my character. So that was a tough one in a culture where, it's not about the individual, it's really about the group. So, but once I kind of overcame that, and I have to say, I'm really fortunate in many ways. My wife's family, they're very accepting of me, and that's not. I wouldn't say it's not really common. It's really not that common. I have friends who've, their family members or their mother-in-law, father-in-laws, or whatever family members don't get along, or there's some level of unacceptance. And so that really made my entrance and living in Japan really much more, still challenging, but I didn't have to deal with that so much. So
that's a very interesting statement you made when you said, "I'm a narcissist by nature," because I think you're the only other person than myself that I've heard say that. I like to say I'm a recovering narcissist.
Yeah.
And it's not in a bad way. Like,
No.
I just acknowledge that there's been a certain trajectory to my life, which has been very self-centric and self-focused. And what I actually believe that does is gives me insight, a special angle into spiritual culture and how narcissistic it is, and how it actually attracts people who are closet narcissists or in denial about their narcissism. And I'll fully admit that's what attracted me. The search for enlightenment at the end of the day is a kind of narcissism. It's me. How do I take care of me, my suffering, my liberation, me? That's what the focus is. Again, this is not said in a judgmental kind of way, but it's interesting to hear you say that. And because let's step back for a second, because how you and I connected is through your reading of my blog, correct? How did you come across my blog?
It's funny, because I've watched all of your YouTube podcasts here, and I think you asked the question to everybody. I don't know if a couple of them said, and this is how I felt. Like, I don't recall how I came across. I don't know if it was like the AI, what is it, the metrics, how they work, how the algorithms rather, or what, but I came across it on Facebook, and I have to say, this is the first time we've talked. I mean, we've exchanged a little bit here and there, but on a very small basis. But when I came across your blog, your writings on Facebook, and that I was so ripe. I was right in that space of just letting all of this stuff go. I mean, I couldn't take it anymore, And I read your first book, and it just spoke to me on such a level where it was just like, this is exactly what I needed to, this is exactly where I was at. I tried because I had already let go of Soto Zen, of Zen. I was just like, this is just, after, almost more than 25 years, I'd been practicing, and I can go into details later if we want, but I'd been practicing on and off for years. I was a punk rocker back in my youth, and I still have that inside of me. So I was always skeptical of teachers and leaders. So there's a part of me, and maybe this is that narcissist part, I don't know too as well, but it's like, I never gravitated to a teacher except for one time for 7 years. And that was it. Everything else, I would practice, but I was always just on the outside. but I was still there. I was still in it. So when I came across your book and I read it, it's like I was just so ready. In fact, I even tried. I thought, okay, I let go of Zen, and, this whole Zen thing, and I thought, oh, I'm going to go for non-duality. I'm just going to see where that takes me. It was like I was ready to go down that path for another 20 years, But then your book came along, and I was like, this is it. This is exactly. In fact, I took a workshop with a non-duality teacher. And I don't want to mention names, but anyway, and while it was interesting, it was like afterwards I walked around and it was the same familiar feeling I had and one of the reasons why I let go of studying of Zen practice and meditation was I felt just my walking above, I was just a little above everybody else. You know what I mean? I was on my way again. And I knew, like, there was this and it was just so palpable. It just made me sick, actually. And then when I read your book, I was like, it was just exactly what I needed. And in fact, I think I wrote a blog post shortly after reading your book, or while I was in the middle of it. It was titled Pushing Buddha Off the Cliff. It was just ready to go. And it was just, so I really do owe a debt of gratitude, for the book and your second one too. I've read that one through twice. It's just been it's just a reminder that, this is, but I will say, and this is something I want to bring up with you. It'd be interesting to talk about. I haven't heard any of your guests talk about this, but what do you think, or what's your opinion on, there's something to be said about people, their lives, the trajectory of a person's life. When you're young, if you want to follow that, that common trajectory, you're trying to find your way in life. You're searching, 20s and, in your 20s, that's what you're doing, right? Hopefully 30s, you're starting to find your way. In your 40s, you're in your way. I mean, that's again, the typical path that somebody might take. I didn't take that, but it's like, so what's your sense of, like, you're talking about the whole idea of these the spiritual, these teachers, leading people down these paths that may or may not lead anywhere. I mean, but when you're in your 20s and 30s looking for something, I mean, isn't that kind of what people gravitate towards?
Yeah, I think everybody's seeking something, right? Especially at that age,
Yeah.
People are geared to seek. The reason for that is, in my mind, is the setup of society itself. At the age of 20, you've finally been let loose of whatever, little sanctuary or sandbox of your family's life you've been playing in, which had its own rules, and you're let free into the world. And you're basically trying to figure out, okay, well, I see this huge world in front of me that plays by all these different rules. Well, where do I fit in? The confusion becomes then trying to reconcile that with your spiritual truth. And when I say spiritual, I'm not using the word in a religious sense, but more intrinsic to who you are. That has nothing to do with the societal setup, right? The societal setup is what we call civilization. It's a bunch of rules of engagement and roles and responsibilities. It's a big dramatic stage, and you're trying to say, okay, which character in this drama is best suited to who I am? The true answer is none of these characters are, right? Because you're not a character. But that's the search, is for the true self. When we say the true self, what we're actually not realizing, we're saying the true character. Like, am I a Hamlet? Am I a Macbeth? Am I a villain? Am I a hero? What am I in this drama of life? The problem with spiritual teachers and the culture is that rather than get you off that path, they end up reinforcing that there is a true character, a spiritual character in that drama of life, which is not the truth. The truth is there is no true character. You're just going to pick something, you're going to play it out. You're going to try it out. It's going to be like going into a fitting room. You tried out acting, didn't work out. You were moved to New York, worked out for a little bit, didn't work out. Moved to Japan, it's worked out. Hey, that's the character you're wearing for now. 5 years later, you might say, hey, screw Japan, I want to go somewhere else. And your character will keep changing. But if you're looking for the true character, you're going to be seeking for the rest of your life, because there's no self that is a character that relates one-to-one, maps to any character on that stage. So we're always using the social reference point, whether consciously or unconsciously, to try and determine our own truth. So that's why we're seeking for truth outside and the world to validate it back to us. But if you start from the assumption, which is the correct assumption in my mind, that you are yourself, whether you like it or not, however you feel about it, you are yourself, then seeking that self is bizarre. It's an absurdity. How can you seek what you are? Now, whether non-dualists want to call it a no self, or whether you want to call it a self, I don't care what you call it. Those are just labels. But you are something, whatever that is. And that's unchangeable. And you can never really know that self, because that self is constantly manifesting in relationship to whatever is happening moment to moment. You're constantly discovering new aspects and facets of that self. Even in this conversation, you and I are, right? So the finding of the self, not the seeking, but the discovering of the self, is a lifelong process, moment to moment to moment, happening nonstop. You can't accelerate that, and you can't avoid it. It's always happening. What you can do is delude yourself for creating narratives in your mind about, who is a perfect character, or just like asking the question, what is the purpose of my life? As if there's some great calling that the purpose of my life is to be a writer. Yeah, maybe for now. How do you know what it'll be in 10 years? We don't know, right? What I'm interested in asking you, Ellen, is, a lot of my writing and critique of spiritual culture is obviously aimed at the Western New Age phenomenon, right? Of like westernized, commercialized Zen, commercialized and westernized Hinduism and Advaita and all of that. But you've gone into the heart of it. You've gone into original Zen by studying in Japan. You've been immersed in Japanese Zen culture. What are some of the pitfalls that you see there? What are some of the comparisons or connections that you see there?
Well, ironically, my meditation practice for about the first 10 years was by myself for the most part here. Occasionally I might have, I did sit at some temples nearby, but it wasn't anything. There was no commitment per se, really. But ironically, 5 years ago, I discovered there was a Zen temple, Soto Zen temple, in my neighborhood, like 10 minutes from here, which I had no idea was, And the only reason why I discovered it was my wife, actually one of my good friends brought a really good friend of mine from the States. She was a university movement teacher in the theater world, and she brought some students over. So I helped arrange the accommodations, and I was kind of the tour guide for this group. This was about 5 years ago, and and she comes from that kind of background, sort of meditation. And my wife told me, "Oh, there is a Zen temple." I don't know why she decided to tell me 10 years later. Well, there's a Zen temple in our neighborhood, and I was like, and so she made arrangements for them to go. She talked to the monk, and she made arrangements for them to have a sitting, to sit and experience meditation in the temple in Japan. So that's how I discovered this was there. And so they sit once a month. So it's not every day. It's not this kind of long, arduous, sessions and things like that. It's one Sunday a month for 2 sittings for 40 minutes. 20 and 20, not even, and then that's it. And I'm the only foreigner when I go and sit. I haven't been there for a while because of COVID, but when I was the only foreigner. There's nothing special about it. There's nothing. Nobody's walking around holier than thou. Nobody's walking around. I mean, it's just, you just go and do it. Like there's nothing extra added to it. And that was such an eye-opening experience that, you would just sit, you don't, it's like, I think I sent you, I don't know if you read the chapter on that about Buddhism is not what it seems, but, it's like, I used to walk around, just kind of with this a little slightly holier than thou attitude whenever I would go and visit temples in Kyoto or whatever. It's like, so this was really great. It was just this ordinary experience of sitting. And so there's one thing, and so this is after about the fourth or fifth time sitting there, the monk got comfortable with talking with me, afterwards. And so there's a couple of us talking to the monk. They don't speak English, so it's Japanese back and forth. And and I had to thank him for, taking on the university students, the Americans, and helping them and everything. And the topic turned to mindfulness. And I think some older gentleman said something about about something, I don't know, the conversation, the topic was mindfulness. And the monk said, in relation, I think because I was there, but in relation to the students, he's like, the American students, he's like, he said something along the effects of mindfulness is something special in America. It seems hayateru. Hayateru means like, fashionable, or, that kind of. And we were talking about that, and he's like, but he said in Japan, we just do it. It's nothing more than that. Like, it's just part of the life. It's paying attention to details. It's being right here in this moment. And not everybody does this, but it is literally, I would say, in the air. It is here. It is part of that culture where people pay attention to details. Mindfulness is not anything more special. It's not a spiritual component. It's just what we do. And I think it's connected to the culture. And I think it also has a connection to the kind of group mentality as well. And I talk a lot about that, the struggle with that in my book as well. It's like, how do I move how do I move in relation to a culture that's group mentality when I've been raised as an individual, where it's like me first, and then only until I'm taken care of will I take care of you, And mindfulness kind of helps you. That's what mindfulness is in many ways. I mean, that's one component. So,
yeah, that's an excellent insight about how Japanese people are by default highly mindful. And this is something that starts very early on in kindergarten, is they're able to sit perfectly still and pay attention remarkably well. And I've worked in like Japanese corporate environments, manufacturing environments. I've seen factory workers. There's a reason the quality of their engineering and products is so superior. The attention to detail is unrivaled anywhere else. And the only reason they can do that is because they're so mindful. So it almost seems redundant for a Japanese person to go to Zendo and sit, because they're literally doing that all day long. They're very talented at it. But also what I found by witnessing this is that being mindful doesn't make people happy, because the Japanese as a culture are not necessarily any happier than America is. So you have a culture of people who are very socially oriented, not very egotistically driven, good at being mindful naturally. They're not wandering and like creating drama about past, future scenarios. Well, I mean, there's some mind wandering that goes on, but generally they're able to stay on task, and attention to detail is very precise and across the board in that culture. And yet they have the same pain, they have the same suffering, they have the same depression, if not in some cases even more accelerated. And that was always a great case study for me, which was, mindfulness is great to offset a culture that is constantly preoccupied with, thoughts and ideologies and all of that. But it's not the silver bullet that spiritual culture makes it out to be.
Yeah, you're correct. It's I'm sure you've been in Tokyo during rush hour, morning or evenings, if you ever, and you look down the row of the train, and you just see just nothing but suits and worn out. In fact, my good friend who brought the university students over, one of her first observations was, people look unhappy and tired, and that's part of the culture where they throw themselves into the company, and they work incredibly long hours at the expense of family life. Although I will say that is starting to change with the younger generations. I mean, I don't know when that will really make that change, but that is starting to happen on some level. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, there is suicide rates in Japan. It's people as is high. Train jumpers are kind of a common. That doesn't happen daily, but that's one of the ways. Mental health is, therapy, any antidepressants, things like that, are to the point where I would say it's frowned upon in a way. It's like it's just not part of the culture. It's like you gaman, right? Gaman, you endure your life. That's what it means. Gaman, you endure, you put up with, regardless. You don't express. I mean, can you imagine? So yeah, there is that dark side of mindfulness in a way. It's like, can you imagine, feeling a certain way, but not being able to express it. And so you gaman, you endure, and you just leave it and let it fester. Like, it's like that, that's my definition of hell. I mean, that would be, but you see it, you see it all the time. I mean, but I will say there is something, because this is an aging culture, right? So, meaning the majority of the population are over the age of, 50s, but definitely 60s. So I'm closing in on that. I'm 57 years old. So I'm joining the ranks pretty soon, So, but there is something about growing old in Japan. I've witnessed this a lot. There is a happiness. Something falls away, and you just see it. They're enjoying their lives. It's like I see people out, I see older people out hiking, walking. It's a sakura season now. It's cherry blossoms right now. We're almost full bloom, literally full bloom. And some places already. And you just see throngs of people, and a lot of them, elderly or over the age of maybe their retirement age or whatever, and they're happy. So there is something that happens. Maybe it's just their, and this is not, again, this is generally speaking, but there is something that happens after they retire, especially the men in the way, that something falls away, and they have this kind of, I don't know if it's a realization, I mean, speaking from my experience, I'm 57. I mean, there is something that shifts, in people where it's like, I don't know how old you are, but in your 40s, right?
Yeah, I'm 40 right now.
Yeah. So there is something that shifts in your mind, I think. Again, I go back to something I said earlier, where it's like there are these kind of periods in your life. You're finding your way in your 20s. You're settling down. Again, this is just a typical path, but it's like, but something happens inside. Like, I don't know if it's culturally, societally, that kind of plugs you in that direction that a lot of people take. But it's like when you hit your 50s. And I had a pretty massive midlife crisis here in Japan, which is part of my book, and so I won't go into detail. But something shifts. You care less about what people think. You find, at least for me, maybe this is just having let go of this kind of whole spiritual thing as well. But it's like, you care less what people think. You have nothing to prove anymore. You enjoy the littlest things in life. And now that I've discovered writing, which actually I've been that way for a long time, but it's really more of a part of my life than it used to be. It's like, it's opened my eyes to like just the subtle little things in life, where like this is just the other day, and this happens quite often now. And again, I think this has to do with, having read your book, having let go of all this stuff of spirituality and all that, it's like, but I was riding my bike back from the train station, and I saw this old guy, and he was crossing the street. It was just a very simple act. He was crossing the street. He was more of a shuffle, because he looked like he was pretty old, and he was raising his hand as he was crossing the street, right? Now, if you didn't live in Japan, you wouldn't understand that, right? I mean, it's like when kids cross the street, especially up in elementary and younger, they raise their hand to caution drivers or anybody coming, either way, that there's somebody crossing the street.
It's a smart thing. I don't know why other countries don't do it. I have my kids still do that when they cross the street and raise their hand, because half the time the people driving pickups here, they can't see a kid under 4 feet tall, right? So yeah,
exactly. So, but here's this elderly guy crossing the street, raising his hand. I was moved to tears, because it's like, I got this little, suddenly this little story pops up. It's like, I'm actually working on that right now, but it's like, all those little things I started to notice, as I've gotten older. It's like the richness of the simplest things in life. And I don't know if, I can't because I can't talk about other people's lives, but that just seems to be what happens if you get out of the way. You stop searching, you stop holding on. There was another thing that happened too, that I realized. It's like it would have been interesting to hear Chris talk about this, your last the last podcast. He's a neuroscientist, right?
A neuropsychologist.
Psychologist, okay.
Yeah.
But there, and you may know this too, but I think as you get older, it's like if you see a lot of people, like there's a narrowing of the way they see the world. It's like they've been doing something so long the same way over and over, and that they're thinking and everything just narrows to the point of like if they do something out of the confines of that narrowing, that's really what makes people crotchety. Like that's the angry old man or the angry old woman or whatever. It's like they're doing the same thing over and over. And I think I had a very visceral experience with that, where I don't know what it was that got me out of it, but there was for a period of time I was like, oh man, I do not want to be that guy, So
I have a very similar story to yours with the old man crossing the road with his hand up. As you're aware, every town has like lots of festivals in Japan. Festivals is a big part of, and they have Natsumatsuri, which is a summer festival, and every little town has a summer festival. They'll put up they have street vendors with stalls, and it's a great thing. Everyone loves going to these things. They're so much fun. And I was at our small town's summer festival, and this lady with her stroller and her baby in it, who looked like the baby was 1 year old, kind of with a pacifier in its mouth, holding on to it. And right next to that stroller, another lady, unrelated, I think, had walked up pushing a wheelchair with a really elderly woman in it. She looked like she was over 90 years old. And as you know, Japanese people tend to live pretty long. Mm. And this older lady, missing all her teeth, was sucking on a lollipop. And this wheelchair was right next to the baby, right? And I'm looking at this whole scene. The lady pushing the wheelchair is unaware, like looking at the festival. So is the mother. But the old lady looks at the baby, and the baby looks at the old lady, and they're smiling at each other. And I'm watching this going, holy crap, this is just like gave me goosebumps just to witness that, because that really is it. It starts coming full circle. And I think the 40 to 50 bracket is when that happens. I can feel it happening myself. I have a theory on that, is that we start realizing we're running out of hope. Because the first half of your life is really powered on hope. Hope for the world, hope for yourself, hope for what could happen. By the age of 40 or so, you start realizing, oh shit, none of that is really going to pan out the way I expected it to. And part of that is deflating, but what that opens up is the pragmatic reality, which is, well, okay, so then all those hopes and dreams of me being a famous actor or famous spiritual guru, none of that's panning out. Well, what do I have? And hey, actually, this is not as bad as I thought. I just never looked at it the right way. And that starts dawning, and your life becomes more simple, not simplistic, but simple. And your consciousness becomes more simply oriented towards the ordinary. And as that happens, the joy and the possibility of extracting joy from these mundane occurrences that have always gone around becomes apparent. And you go, holy shit, like it was always possible. And I never recognized it because I was always downplaying what I have for what was possible. So I think that shift starts happening at a certain point of life. And you're right. Some of the happiest elderly people I've ever met in my life were Japanese people. Some of the most active, physically engaged people. I mean, Hokkaido winters are brutal. We used to have, one winter we had over 10 meters of snow. I was shoveling snow 4 to 5 hours a day. And the only reason I didn't buy a snowblower and continued doing it with a snow shovel is because all my neighbors were elderly people who were out there shoveling. I said, I can't be the 30-something-year-old gaijin who's got a snowblower and these elderly, like Japanese geriatrics, like with a smile on their face, going out at 5 a.m, shoveling like 3 feet of snow. It's part of their culture. They recognize the value of being engaged physically in gardening and doing it well, like that attention to detail, because they realize that's what brings them into the moment, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Back to hope. I was kind of exploring that word for a while. Somebody had posted, actually my former acting teacher who's in Los Angeles now. Well, she'd been there for a long time, but she posted something about what is the definition. I don't know why she's, I don't know why, but she posted, what is the definition of hope? And I had been exploring this word for quite a while, and the only thing I can come up with now is it's disappointment. Hope is disappointment in disguise. It's like, it's really, that's really kind of what it is. It's like, it brings you out in the future. It sets you up for expectations. It sets you up for disappointment because it's never going to be what you think it is. Not to mention, and this was something, again, I struggle with too. Even I went through this kind of period as an actor. I failed. I failed as an actor. To live with failure, initially, especially in America, and we really went for it. I had the equation down. Like, I had the equation. I sold all my worldly goods. I put it all up in, I put money in the bank. I gave up my job, my condo, my fiery red Jetta, and I moved to New York to be an actor, right? That was the equation that's going to set me up for success. Right? That was it. It's like, and it's such an American thing. It's rugged individualism. It's like, it's the pioneering attitude that runs so deep. And after about 4 years of doing this and realizing that it was like suddenly like, this isn't working. Like, I did my taxes. I'm spending more on classes than I'm doing, it's like, and so that bubble burst, and it was so painful, that realization, And I had to go through it again as in my writing. It was like, I had this equation. I was like, I am going to, I do this and I do this and that. And I caught myself in that process again, where it's like, and I just had to let it all go and go, it doesn't matter. Like, none of that shit matters. I write because I just love to do it. I don't care what people think. I'm not doing it to make money. I'm not doing it other than just to put it out there. And that's what I do. It's like, the same thing with my book. I'm going to self-publish because I don't, I'd rather, be able to put it out there on my terms at this point anyway. It's like, it just doesn't matter, and that's, I think, to me, that's the beauty of aging too. It's like, it's just, you got nothing to prove anymore. There's no hope. There's just this, and I think that's and maybe I'll get there. I don't know. It's weird. And I don't know if you experience this, or people listening, but it's like, I can't, it's almost like there's a built-in mechanism inside now that stops me from going into the future in my mind. Like, I can't go there anymore. I can't. Like, when I try, it's almost like this, I don't know if it's an intelligence or something. Again, I'm just speaking from experience. This is not scientific, but it's like, it's almost like when I take myself out to that place beyond this spot right now, it's like the anxiety starts to build, and that's enough to shut everything down, because I start to recognize that feeling and go, and I may do it, but I can't hang out there. It just comes back, because it's almost the same thing with the past, although the past is a little different. Now that I've thrown myself into writing, I've been doing this for probably 4 or 5 years now. I write every day, 1 to 2, 3 hours a day. It's like, it's just a part of my life. But so the past is a little different, for me, because I bring a kind of a creative component to it. So it's not like I'm lamenting the past, or I'm not hanging out back there, feeling sorry for myself or whatever. It's to bring up things to add, to be able to write about. So,
with the word hope, again, like was it your acting teacher who asked that question? Yeah. It depends on the way we define the word hope, right? If we're defining the word hope as optimism, then I agree with you, because, there's that very simplistic way of, looking at happiness as reality minus expectations. And the higher your expectation value is, the lower your happiness goes down, because, reality is reality, and anything you subtract from it or try to add to it is going to decrease your happiness level. Obviously, that's a very simplistic way to look at it, but hope really, if it is defined as optimism, becomes what deviates from reality in your mind. And I think it was James Stockdale, the former vice admiral of the United States Navy. I don't know if you know the story, Stockdale's story, but he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and he was put in one of those nasty Vietnamese Viet Cong trenches, and unsanitary, in a hole with rats living around him for months on end. And he basically, he used to read the words of Epictetus, the famous Stoic philosopher. And it's the words of Epictetus, and the Stoics were very pragmatic. Right? It was in the words of Epictetus that that helped him sort of pass that point, and the pain and the duress that he was put under is just constantly adapting his perspective to the reality rather than, and he mentioned that the people who lasted the least time in those holes, the prisoners who lasted the least time, were those who were optimistic. That it was like, oh, we'll get out next week, or oh, we'll get out the month after. They're the ones who went crazy first. They were the ones who broke down. It were the ones who were more, oh, this is the shit we're in right now, and there's nothing we can do about it. It is what it is. That managed to make it through, and Stockdale was one of them. And he attributes a lot of his success in being able to deal with that circumstance to the Stoic teachings, right? The other definition of hope would be one called, which is faith. And not faith like religious belief, not kind of faith, but more that intuition that things are going to work out. It's not hope in the sense of you have to believe in something that is not fact, but there's this internal instinct in the success of what's going to happen. That doesn't take anything to maintain. It's just there by default. And if that is the definition of hope, I would say that's a positive phenomenon. But it's not something you can make happen. It's something that organically arises within you. And I'll point to my experience of moving from Japan during the pandemic back to Canada, to a part of Canada we've never been to before. And I mentioned this on the last podcast as well, the variables and unknowns in that circumstance, especially like you're a family man, you know what it's like, putting your family through that kind of uncertainty. But there was that powerful instinct of knowing it's going to work out. There wasn't optimism at all. In fact, intellectually, I was being as pessimistic about it as possible, right?
Yeah. That's you mentioned the Stoics. I discovered the Stoics probably within the last year or so. I get their I don't forget who it is, but I get the daily in my email box. I get a little Stoic, one of the whatever, a quote or something, a topic from the Stoics, and which brings me to something which I've sent you a couple of links and some things that I've been interested in as of late, and it's kind of connected to, it's like, maybe we can talk a little bit about this, the kind of spiritual, the spiritual world in that sense. But it's like, I used to have all these books on Zen and stuff, and all this stuff, like Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which is a kind of a famous book by. That's the lineage where I kind of studied. I was kind of connected to San Francisco Zen Center for a long time. It's a great, wonderful book. And but like all of those books, that one, I'll just set that one aside because there's just something about that that's really, but a lot of the books that are subsequent books that were written just had this smell of, I call it the smell of Zen. You know what I mean? It's like this smell of spirituality. Everyone has their own little scent. I'm sure Krishnamurti, non-duality has their thing, and it's like what I found recently is like I'm reading this. I sent you the link, but Henry Miller, he was recommended to me to read by my editor of my book, and I started reading. He wrote a book called On Writing, and if you want a spiritual book, it's like incredible in the sense that he's writing about his struggles of his life. He's writing about his awakening of his life, but not in a spiritual kind of, there's no smell. It's just a life, Same Same thing with the Stoics. There's something about the Stoics. It's like, they have their own kind of thing, but it's like, it's not laced with anything else. You know what I mean? And the other thing, and I sent you a couple of links, Terrence McKenna. Now, I'm not advocating psychedelic drug use, but he did go to a place where most people don't go to, and he came back to talk about, And so I've been really drawn to a lot of what he said. And this is 1990. Some of the stuff, and I don't know if you watched that, it was a 13-minute video, but he talks about this whole idea of walking away from the system in a sense, not playing that game if you're willing to go to that place. Not that you go and take psychedelics and go, I'm just going to walk away. There's a practicality to doing that. It's like, how much do you want to be part of the system? How much do you want to play? How much do you want to, he's like, and he's, and it's so I'm starting to see where it's like you get stuff everywhere, and not just in this kind of small, although there's thousands and thousands of books, as there's other places that you can get reminders,
Oh, well, that's exactly right. And this is why, I continue to use the word spiritual and spirituality, because I see everything as a source of that. I was watching an old video of the famous physicist, Richard Feynman. He's one of the foremost physicists of the modern era, right? Absolute genius, like, rivaling Einstein, right? And the interviewer asked Richard Feynman, magnetic fields, why do two magnets push against each other? Why do we feel the magnetic force? And Feynman's answer is a 20-minute answer, which is absolutely beautiful, and the study of the spiritual inquiry process. And Feynman laughs at the guy, and the guy gets a little bit offended. He goes, why, is that not a good question? And Feynman goes, no, it's an excellent question. But how I answer that question is completely relative to your own understanding of life. So he said, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but basically Feynman starts to break down not the question of why magnetic fields touch, but the question of why. He says, the only way I can explain that to you is, first, I need to explain to you what magnetic fields are, right? You need some kind of background in your understanding to truly understand the answer of why they touch. He said, I could tell you that the reason magnets don't touch is the same reason when you touch your leg with your finger doesn't go through. It's actually the same fields repelling each other. Just in magnets, it happens over greater distance. And then you might ask me, well, why doesn't my finger go through? And then I'll have to talk to you about that. And that's the reason kids, really young kids, can keep asking the question why, because they don't have the framework of understanding. And Feynman himself says that eventually, when you ask those questions why long enough, all reasoning becomes circular. You find yourself giving answers that begin with assumptions that don't have any justification. And that is the root of thinking, even within science. And that was just like a fascinating case study for me on spiritual inquiry, because that should be the point of spiritual inquiry, to inquire to the point of realizing there's no answer at the root of the question. But spiritual culture isn't pragmatic in that way. Really, the spiritual industry should be the industry of ultimate pragmatism, but it's not. It's the industry of hope. And that's the smell we were referring to, is the smell of hope. Even in a guy like Krishnamurti, who's pretty staid and, very like professor, like, there's the smell of hope in his writing. And, it's just what degree of hope are these guys projecting? But very few spiritual teachings are rooted in pragmatism, just literally give you nothing to clutch onto other than what is ordinary and around you anyways. Because then how do you generate hope out of what is already here? You can't. You can only generate hope out of what is possible. And that's what every spiritual teaching is, always projecting what is possible. The ultimate possibility being enlightenment, of course. Right.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I chased that carrot, for that enlightenment carrot, for a very long time, not having an idea. Like I would say, I haven't really talked about this much, but I'm not sure if you know, but so I've been in the other AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm pretty open about it. My whole philosophy on that is, they say anonymous, and I I don't drink. I haven't drank for over 30 years. It's just a part of my life. It's kind of sunk into my bones. And I don't, like, I still go to bars. I still hang out with friends who drink. It's like, I'm not one of those kind of, demagogues that just like, I don't want that to impede on anybody's life. Like I made a conscious decision a long time ago that that's just part of my life. It's no big deal. But I've had, just through working those steps, and I think one of your guests mentioned early. I think it was, I don't know, I forget which one was it. Maybe Luke. Was he the one that had some? We didn't see his face the whole time. Was that?
Oh yeah, that was Benjamin Smythe who.
Benjamin, yeah.
He has
I think
bipolar.
So he mentioned something about AA. I have to say the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's something about it, and again, this is not promoting it. This is just my experience. But it's like there's something about that where you uncover. They walk you through this process of like, almost like, looking outward to your problems, to bringing you back inside, to dealing with it. And as a consequence, as a result of having gone through that, I've had some, whatever you want to call it, for lack of a better term, spiritual experiences. Like some things have happened, and it's been, been wonderful. But then over time, it just falls away. And it's like, but I was still practicing meditation and Zen. So I was still looking for those. Like I still wanted that experience. I still wanted that enlightenment, or I still wanted whatever that was. Eventually, as I mentioned before, as I, this is only in the last couple of years, I would say, but really probably in the last 2 years, where all that stuff just fell away, and I'm not searching for that anymore. It's like this is all there is anyway. It's like, and so, but I will say that something has happened. You talked about your your kind of, I don't know if it's awakening, but your experience where you when you were younger. It's like, for me, it's never been that. I think it's just been this gradual process. I've had things along the way, but it's been this gradual process of whatever, things falling away, and whatever the veil and whatever, all that stuff you want to call it, just kind of, just dropped away, so.
Well, as somebody who has been an alcohol addict and a spiritual addict, what kind of parallels do you see between the two, having been in both shoes?
Well, again, I didn't talk about this, but for about 7 years, I studied I studied with this guy in Vermont, and he was a wonderful guy. Great. He was a biophysiologist. So we studied the nature of character. I was introduced to him in my acting days, in a way, as a way to study character and develop characters. But then it became more personal in nature, and it basically consisted of weekend workshops and things where we would do these different activities, and within the confines of community, we'd help each other kind of point out the habits and things that we do that were habitual in nature, that kind of got in the way of seeing what's happening in that moment. Sounds a little ethereal, but the point is that one of the things he said to me, this was a long time ago, was like, you are addicted to sadness. I didn't quite know what he meant by that, but then as we kind of explored that more, he's like, you have this emotion, this kind of heaviness to your character of who you are, yourself or whatever. So the emotionality part of what exists inside, you grab the stories or the thoughts that flow through your mind that keep you in that place of sadness, And he was absolutely right. And it's like, it was like, forget the happy thoughts. It's like, I'm going for the sadness, because that's just my habitual character, my nature. And I think the parallel to addiction, so, I was addicted to sadness. The parallel to alcohol addiction, or the parallel to spiritual addiction, is they're addicted to happiness. Like they're looking, so they have that, they've had a taste of it. So what they do is they continually grab, whether it's the teacher saying something or whether it's the thought coming through, but they continually grab the happy thought. and missing out on all the other stuff that goes through, all the other thoughts, or even the emotion, because the emotions are always flowing. You're always changing from one point to another. But if you hold on to that happy emotion, you need to reinforce it by grabbing that happy thought, And so I think, to me, that's, in a way, that's the parallel. It's an addiction, it's an addiction to wanting to be happy. Good God, I don't want to be happy. If I was happy all the time, that would just suck. It would suck. I get angry. I just posted something on my blog site. It's called "The Scene from a Kamakura Bus Stop." This just happened last week. I lost my shit to an old woman. If you get a chance, read the story. But it's like, I kind of dramatized it for entertainment purposes. I embellish a little bit, but it's like, life happens. And if I'm just going to grab happiness, I just would be bored out of my mind,
Yeah, and what ends up happening then is, in order to grab or hyper focus on one experience or emotional experience of life, you end up repressing other emotions that naturally, organically come up. And that could happen by hyper focusing on those sadness, the dark emotions, and then you repress the other more effervescent, light emotions that come up in you. Or on the flip side, like you mentioned, hyper focus on the happy emotions, and you keep repressing the negative emotions. What ends up happening eventually is a sudden backlash effect, often unpredictable, like Will Smith walking up on stage and slapping Chris Rock. It's you have an idea of yourself in your mind, which is excessively love and light, which incidentally came out later in his Best Actor acceptance speech, where he clearly very narcissistically motivated, calling himself a river unto his people and all that kind of, it sounds like a messiah complex, but spiritual people will have those kinds of outbursts, which are very uncharacteristic of them. This happens constantly with teachers, and people are scandalized. How did somebody who's this paragon of virtue behave in such a heinous way? Or how can somebody who's so kind and compassionate have been so violent and abusive? It's because the moment you start repressing emotions are energies. The moment you start repressing things, they begin coming out. And this happens in Japan all the time, right? You have the Japanese disgruntled worker is far more violent and destructive than the American one. American workers will go, fuck you, to management and storm out. Japanese worker will smash every piece of equipment in the office. And we've seen this a number of times because they're constantly repressing their frustration to the point where it just goes off like a nuclear bomb. And you're right. This is one of the contentions I've had with spirituality in general, the culture of it, is this failure to recognize human emotion as something that doesn't need to be controlled, and B, something of great value, the entire spectrum of it. And in my past articles, I've likened it to music. It's like when playing a beautiful piano piece, you're not going to stick to the right side of the piano keyboard and play only the lighter notes because they're all happy and giddy. And you're not going to just sit there playing the dark, somber notes either. It's limited. You want the full range to play. You want the freedom to play with the full range of emotions. So why not also in our manifestation of the full range of emotions a human being can feel? Understanding we can get hung up on anything. We can get hung up on bliss. We can get hung up on anger or anything. And then that becomes an opportunity for us to investigate. Why am I getting hung up on that? Right. Yeah. And I wonder if through your work with your AA, and how did that emotional balance eventually come about?
How did it come about? I think the only thing I can say is trial and error, and just, internal exploration and connected to writing. I mean, I don't know what your process of writing is, but something that I do every day is I call it, I just throw up on the page. I just put it out there, whatever that stuff's on my mind, or something that's kind of been, and it's, sometimes it's very private, like nobody reads this. So it's like, I can be really, really candid, and, and I just get it out, AA meetings, which I still attend, if something's going on, like I had a rough patch about 6 years ago with family, with my real marriage and stuff. And it's like I would talk about it. Not that I would expect it to go away, but I would get it out, and then over time, I would give there's some clarity, and things would start to sort out in a way on their own, without my doing something. I think it's whenever I started doing something, that's when things started to, because I would inherently do it my way, and that's not the way, it's just, I needed to really just get out of the way. And so I started to learn that over time with trial and error. The other big thing, and you mentioned, the Japanese office worker, losing his shit and just going crazy. So I've done that. I have to be I have to be pretty hyper vigilant at times. Like I mentioned last week, I had a moment, it's like I repressed some stuff, and I had a moment. I got in a fight. This is in my book in details, but I got in a fight on the train in Tokyo about 5 years ago. I got the shit beat out of me. I got a black eye on my way to teach, and I had to explore what was going on, and it was repressing, this, it was just keeping that stuff down, the thing that, so fortunately the episodes, if they do happen, are not quite as dramatic, I almost got in a fight in New York, but I got in a fight in Japan. Think about that. That's just crazy. New York, maybe, but Japan, but that is exactly the reason. It's like it's repression. The other thing I have to be, the other thing in my life is projection. It's like I need to be really mindful or whatever, wary of projection. It's like it's so easy to put it on the other and not take responsibility. And having been in AA and whatever other things that I've done along the way, it's like, I've learned that it just, it just doesn't, it doesn't work. I was in line at I was in line at a coffee shop the other day, and they have tables outside the train station where I like to sit and just kind of watch the world go by while I'm writing. All the seats were taken except for one table, and it had this kind of crumpled up pet bottle on it. And so it wasn't like I knew that the person wanted the table or not. It might have just been garbage. I moved it out of the way, and I put my backpack there to go get my coffee. And this big hulking guy walks past me with a cup of coffee and sits down in that table and takes my backpack and moves it out of the way. As I'm waiting in line to get my coffee, there it goes in my head. Like I can see it in real time, the projection. And like a teenager, I was playing out all these scenarios in my mind. Like, I want to beat this guy up, or I'm going to talk to him in English and freak him out. But, and he was this big hulking guy, man. It's like, are you kidding me? Am I going to go down this path again? Like, and so I get my coffee, I go out, and I apologize. My backpack's there. And you know what happens? He offers for me to have a seat next to him at the table. Like, those are I was like, this is what happens, but it's like, but it's not actually playing out the way I think, but, so I have to really be, I don't know what that is, other than I think it's, and again, I don't know if you can relate to this, but with the writing, but I think it has to do with my imagination as a writer now. Like, there's just something freed up, or it's just, I just let myself go, and I just need to be able to discern reality from the imagination. So.
I find writing cathartic. And the reason I continue to write, I don't have as much time to do it anymore, but I still make a point to try and write something small, or, every once in a while, a short post. I can't do the long essays anymore, just because of the nature of my circumstances at the moment with work. But the difference between writing and thinking is that thinking is recursive. So you keep thinking the same thought over and over and over again, really getting nowhere with it. Whereas writing is a process in which it's very sort of methodical, and it lays out your own reasoning of your mind for you. And it's a way of getting whatever's processing up here processed through the form of articulating and expressing it. And this is why expression is so important, whether it's through writing or art or whatever form of expression a person requires. And the opposite, repression, is so destructive, because otherwise it's caught processing and never gets fully processed. And so for people who tend to be compulsive personality types like I am, or people who tend to be overly narcissistic, that label narcissistic, I don't see it as a negative thing It's just a person who is compulsive about themselves, who is compulsively reflecting on themselves. And so a good way for a narcissist to deal with that compulsion is to express themselves. In fact, it's more paramount for a narcissist to express themselves than anybody else. It's therapeutic. Whether they're expressing themselves for somebody else is not the point, but to get it out in order for it not to be trapped in is a very useful tool. So that's, and I found like I'm able to, especially in my youth, I used to write a lot of poetry, not so much now, but in my 20s, especially through my depression and anxiety, in the heat of it, some of my most beautiful poetry, it just resolved, not got rid of, but brought it full circle for me, every bit of angst I was feeling, right? So I totally understand where you're coming from as a writer. Talk a little bit about this book that you're going to be, when are you planning to publish it?
Well, so the title is 10K LRS, which is that's the amalgam, meaning 10,000 lakes to the rising sun. So 10K LRS. So 10K, 10,000 lakes. So 10,000 lakes is in the state. I don't know if Canada has this, but in the United States, so each license plate on the car, each state has their own motto, like at the top. So yeah, Minnesota is okay. So land of 10,000 lakes. That's Minnesota. So 10,000 lakes. Japan has their, the land of the rising sun, right? So I titled it 10K LRS, 10,000 lakes to the rising sun, with a kind of a subtitle, because the subtitle is a semi-autobiographical travel log. And the reason why I titled that, so the proofreader that I have in LA, he sent me back the proofreading for me to accept about 2 weeks ago. He sent a little synopsis after. He's like, I'm not quite sure who your audience is, And when I first read that, I was a little bit offended, because it's like I had this expectation, like, oh yeah, well, I know my audience. It's like, okay, well, somebody had a set of eyes saw that they don't know who the audience is. And then I realized it's really not it's such a wide range of the topics explored. So it's kind of a journey. It's a little bit of, again, I hesitate to use the word, but spiritual kind of, it's humor, it's cultural critique, it's a travel log. So people who have never been to Japan or whatever, learning a little bit of language along the way. It's some suggestions to do and not to do. But it's basically a journey about all of my kind of faux pas and all the things that I've gone through and how I got to Japan and all the experiences. And which has been I've been working on it for about 4 years. Probably would have happened faster if I didn't have a son, but that's priorities, as you know. My goal is to get it out in June, I hope, as a e-version initially. I do want to print up. So I have this kind of this dream. So back in the punk rock days in the early 80s in Minneapolis and the US, there's this whole DIY mentality, do it yourself. So these bands and these groups would like set up their own shows across the country, and they just get in a van and they drive across and they play, and then it's like, so it was really kind of trench like DIY, And I have this vision. I want to print up about 500 books, and I want to. So when my wife and son are supposed to move to the States next year, so get them settled in the States. And what I want to do is prior to going there, I want to contact a bunch of small bookstores, rent a car, and just drive across and do readings and hawk my book. And when whatever comes of it, it'd be kind of a nice trip and a good way to see the U.S. in a way, a different light from where I'm coming from now, right? So, so that's kind of the plan, but we'll see what happens.
Well, keep us updated as to when that's getting published. I'll be more than happy to share it on my page, and at least get our readership interested in it. It's been great chatting with you, Ellen. I've really enjoyed it, and especially that Japan connection. I think I don't get to talk to a lot of people who have that insight into Japan, and obviously I have a soft spot for the country, having spent so many years there. So it's been a great chat, and we'll keep in touch.
Yeah, well, thank you. I do. Again, I appreciate the chance to converse. I mean, I'm glad we were able to do this. And I will say there's a standing invitation to come and visit if you ever do come anytime. I think, in fact, one of my first times I reached out to you, because I thought you were still in Japan. I thought, and I didn't know you were in Hokkaido. But I am planning on buying a kominka, which is an old style Japanese house in Yamanashi, which is the mountainous region outside of Tokyo. I should find out if I can get it in April. Beautiful, big house, great views. So if you ever are in Japan, and I do have that house in itself set up, you are welcome to, you and your family are welcome to stay. So
that's a great invitation. And to be honest with you, once this whole pandemic thing dies down and the world goes back to some kind of a normal where travel is concerned, I mean, we plan to go visit Japan every year or every 2 years. So that's a big part of our family's life. Our children grew up there. So it'll be great to connect with you whenever that is.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Take care, Alan.
All right. Thank you.